A Greek fisherman's son from a village near Thessaloniki wakes up one morning in 1520 to find his world has changed. Ottoman tax collectors have arrived, not to seize his family's boat or force conversion to Islam, but to record his catch, assess his taxes, and move on. His neighbor, a Jewish merchant who fled Spain 30 years ago, pays a different tax rate. The Muslim Turkish family down the street pays yet another rate. All three families will send their sons to different schools, worship in different buildings, settle disputes in different courts, and live under different community leaders. Yet all three are subjects of the same empire. This isn't chaos. This is the most sophisticated bureaucratic system the world had seen since Rome fell. This is an empire that figured out how to govern 30 million people across 3 continents, without computers, without phones, without any of the technology we think is necessary for large-scale organization. This is an empire that created the modern concept of a cabinet government, invented new financial instruments, built bureaucratic systems that European kingdoms studied and copied, and did all of this while managing religious and ethnic diversity that would have torn apart any medieval European state. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire told not through sultans and battles. You already know those stories, but through the systems, institutions, and ordinary people who made the empire actually work day to day for 600 years. Because here's what most people miss. The Ottoman Empire wasn't powerful because of great sultans. Great sultans came and went. Weak sultans ruled for decades. The empire had periods of brilliant leadership and periods where incompetent drunks sat on the throne. Yet the empire continued functioning, collecting taxes, maintaining order, defending borders, and managing complexity. How? Through institutions so robust that they survived bad leadership, through systems so sophisticated that they adapted to changing circumstances, and through a pragmatic approach to governance that put practical results ahead of ideological purity. This is the Ottoman Empire as a system, not a story of heroes. And once you understand the system, you understand why this empire lasted longer than any other Islamic power, why it influenced European governance models, and why its collapse created chaos that still reverberates today. Before we dive into the machinery of empire, the boring, brilliant, brutal bureaucracy that actually made it all work. If you enjoy understanding the systems behind history rather than just the surface-level drama, consider subscribing for more content that explores how empires actually function, and comment below, which institutional innovation do you think was the Ottomans' most important? Part 1. The bureaucratic, revolshake-ratic. Nobody talks about. Let's start with a question that seems simple, but isn't. How do you actually govern an empire? Not in theory, not in the abstract sense of the Sultan rules, but in practice. How do you collect taxes from millions of people? How do you enforce laws across thousands of miles? How do you maintain an army when you're not actively fighting? How do you keep provinces from just declaring independence when they're weeks of travel away from the capital? Medieval kingdoms mostly didn't solve these problems. European feudalism was essentially a system where the king didn't really control most of his kingdom. He had vassals who controlled territories, and those vassals had sub-vassals, and authority was fragmented across hundreds of semi-independent nobles. The king's actual power often extended only as far as his personal army could march. The Byzantine Empire had solved these problems through an elaborate bureaucracy inherited from Rome. But even Byzantium struggled with provincial governors becoming too powerful and trying to seize the throne. The Ottomans looked at both systems and built something different. The core innovation was the timur system, and it's brilliant in ways that aren't obvious until you understand what problem it solves. Here's how it worked. Instead of paying soldiers' salaries in cash, which requires collecting taxes, transporting money, and creating opportunities for embezzlement at every step, the Ottoman state granted military officers revenue rights to specific territories. If you were a sipahi, cavalry soldier, you'd be granted a timar, the right to collect taxes from a specific area. That revenue was yours to keep. But in exchange, you had to report for military service when called, maintain your equipment, and bring additional soldiers proportional to your timar's revenue. Think about what this accomplishes. First, it solves the cash flow problem. The empire doesn't need to physically collect taxes, transport money to a central treasury, and then redistribute it to soldiers. The tax collection and payment happen in the same place. Second, it distributes military forces across the empire. Every province has Sipahis living there, who have a personal financial interest in maintaining order and protecting their revenue source. You've created a distributed defense system. Third, it prevents the creation of hereditary military aristocracy. Timars were theoretically non-hereditary. When a Sipahi died, his sons had to prove their military competence to inherit the Timars. In practice, this wasn't always enforced, but the principle meant that Timars couldn't become permanent feudal holdings the way European fiefs did. Fourth, it ties military service directly to land productivity. When the economy grows, timur revenues increase, allowing Sipahis to bring more soldiers. The military scales with economic capacity automatically. This system supported the largest cavalry force in Europe for centuries. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire could field over 90,000 Sipahi cavalry, each bringing additional soldiers and equipment. No European kingdom could match this without bankrupting itself. But the Timar system was just one piece of a larger bureaucratic machine. The empire was divided into provinces called elates, each governed by a belabey, provincial governor. These were further divided into sanjaks, districts, governed by sanjak beys, and those into smaller administrative units. At each level, there were officials responsible for tax collection, legal administration, military mobilization, and public order. But here's the key. These officials weren't local nobles who inherited their positions. They were appointed by the central government. They could be transferred, promoted, or dismissed. They were paid by the state, and critically, they were monitored by multiple overlapping systems to prevent corruption and rebellion. The Ottoman bureaucracy developed a sophisticated system of checks and balances that would impress modern administrative theorists. Local judges, quaitaires, reported independently to the central government. They weren't under the authority of provincial governors. This meant governors couldn't control the legal system in their provinces. Tax collectors were separate from military authorities. The people who collected taxes weren't the same people who commanded troops, making military coups harder to organize. The imperial treasury sent inspectors, teftish, to audit provincial administrations. These inspectors had authority to investigate any official and report directly to Istanbul. The Sultan's intelligence network included informants throughout the empire who reported on officials' activities. Corruption, abuse of power, or signs of rebellion could be detected and punished. Military units were rotated. Janissaries stationed in one province would be moved to another. Sipahis from one region might campaign in another. This prevented military units from developing local loyalties that could enable rebellion. This created a system where no single official could accumulate enough independent power to threaten the state. You might be a provincial governor with thousands of troops under your nominal command, but you couldn't pay those troops without the tax collectors. You couldn't control the legal system because judges were independent. You were being watched by inspectors and spies, and your military units would be rotated away if you stayed in one place too long. It was paranoid, but it was effective. European diplomats and travelers who visited the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries were amazed by how well organized it was. The French political philosopher Jean Baudin studied Ottoman administrative practices. The Venetians maintained detailed intelligence reports on Ottoman bureaucratic systems. European kings looked at Ottoman governance and tried to copy aspects of it. The Ottomans had essentially invented the modern cabinet system before European kingdoms adopted it. The Devenu Humayun Imperial Council consisted of the Grand Vizier and various ministers responsible for different government functions: military affairs, finance, foreign relations, religious administration, and justice. These officials met regularly, made collective decisions, and implemented policy across the empire. This was revolutionary. Most medieval kingdoms had informal royal councils, where whoever the king trusted gave him advice. The Ottomans had a formal institutional structure with defined roles, regular procedures, and documentary records. And here's something that will blow your mind. The Ottomans were obsessive record keepers. The Ottoman archives in Istanbul contain millions of documents, literally millions. Tax records, court judgments, imperial edicts, administrative correspondence, military orders, census data, land surveys. For a historian, it's an incredible treasure. For anyone interested in how empires actually functioned, it's proof that the Ottomans took bureaucracy seriously. They knew that power doesn't come from having the biggest army, Every empire eventually faces an enemy with a bigger army. Power comes from being able to mobilize resources efficiently, maintain an institutional continuity through crises, and create systems that function even when individual leaders are incompetent. The Ottoman Empire had incompetent sultans who barely left the palace. It had periods of internal conflict and external pressure, but the bureaucracy kept functioning. Taxes got collected, courts operated, roads were maintained. The system worked. This is what made the Ottoman Empire different from other Islamic empires and most European kingdoms. It wasn't built around individual greatness. It was built around institutional capacity. Now let's talk about the most controversial and fascinating part of this system: how the Ottomans recruited their elite. Part 2. The Devshirme Istem. Izeveri es meritocracy. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian villages in the Balkans, carrying detailed instructions and quotas. They were looking for boys, specifically Christian boys between roughly 8 and 18 years old, who met certain criteria: intelligent, physically capable, and from families that weren't too wealthy or too poor. These boys would be taken from their families, converted to Islam, and entered into Ottoman state service through the Devshirme system. By modern standards, this is horrifying. It's kidnapping, it's forced conversion, it's slavery. Even if these boys were entering a form of slavery that could lead to power and wealth rather than field labor. But from an institutional design perspective, it's genius, and that's what makes it so disturbing. Think about the problem facing any empire. How do you create a governing class that's loyal to the central authority rather than to tribal, ethnic, or family networks? If you recruit your officials from the existing aristocracy, those officials have their own power bases, their own families, their own agendas. They might use government positions to benefit their families or regions rather than the empire. They might rebel if they think they can get away with it. If you recruit from your own ethnic or religious group, you risk creating factions based on clan or sectarian loyalties. Ottoman history has plenty of examples of Turkish tribal leaders trying to assert independence or religious figures challenging sultanic authority. The Devshirme system solved this by creating officials who were completely dependent on the sultan for their status. A Christian boy taken from a Serbian village, converted to Islam, and raised in Ottoman institutions had no tribal connections among Turkish aristocracy. He had no family power base to inherit. His entire identity was constructed within the Ottoman system. His only path to status and wealth was through loyal service to the Sultan. And here's where it gets even more interesting. These Devshirme boys weren't just thrown into military service. The most talented were identified and given elite educations. The Enderun system, the palace school, took the most promising Devshirme recruits and put them through years of rigorous training. They learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied Islamic theology, law, history, mathematics, and administration. They were trained in military skills, horseback riding, and weapons. They learned music, poetry, and courtly etiquette. This was the most elite education available in the empire. It was better than what most Turkish Muslim boys received. It was designed to produce not just soldiers, but administrators, governors, and grand viziers. And it worked. Look at the list of Ottoman grand viziers, the most powerful position in the empire after the Sultan. A huge percentage came through the Devshirme system. Mahmud Pasha, Angelovich, Grand Vizier 1453, 146 in 147, 147. Born Christian in Serbia or Bosnia, probably from a Byzantine noble family, rose to become Mehmed II's most important advisor and commanded armies that expanded the empire. Ibrahim Pasha, Grand Vizier 1523, 1536, probably from Albania or Croatia, became Suleiman the Magnificent's closest friend and most powerful official. He married Suleiman's sister and accumulated wealth and power that rivaled the Sultan himself. Sokalu Mehmed Pasha, Grand Vizier 1579, born in Bosnia to a Serbian Orthodox family, served 3 sultans and was effectively the main power behind the throne during periods of weak sultanic leadership. Kopruli Mehmed Pasha, Grand Vizier 1656, 1661, Albanian origin, founded the Köprülü political dynasty that produced 5 grand viziers over several generations and temporarily arrested Ottoman decline in the 17th century. These weren't token appointments. These were the men who actually ran the empire, commanded armies, negotiated with foreign powers, and made policy decisions that affected millions. The system was meritocratic in a way that no other contemporary society matched. Yes, it was based on slavery. Yes, it required forced conversion, but within the system, talent could rise regardless of birth. A shepherd's son from a Bosnian village could become the second most powerful person in an empire that stretched from Budapest to Baghdad. Compare this to European societies where aristocratic birth determined your opportunities. A talented peasant boy in France or England had virtually no path to high office. The church offered some mobility, but you weren't going to become a duke or command royal armies. The Ottomans had created a system where the empire's elite were selected based on observed talent and then trained extensively for their roles. It was rational state building taken to an extreme, but it came with costs that get overlooked when we focus just on the successful individuals. For every Ibrahim Pasha who became Grand Vizier, thousands of Devshirme boys became janissaries, elite infantry soldiers who lived in barracks, never married officially, and served until they were too old to fight. They had status above ordinary soldiers and could be influential in politics, but they weren't ruling provinces or becoming wealthy. And for every boy taken through the Devshirme, there was a family that was destroyed. Parents who never saw their children again. Sisters and brothers who lost siblings. Communities that lost their young men. The Ottomans tried to make the system seem less brutal. Christian communities in the Balkans were officially exempt from military service as a trade-off for providing Devshirme boys. Some families saw it as an opportunity for their sons to advance. A few even tried to get their sons selected, hoping they'd rise through the system and be able to help their families. But the psychological trauma of forced separation, forced conversion, and forced identity change must have been immense. We don't have many sources from the boys themselves. Most Devshirme recruits who rose high enough to leave records presented their pasts as stories of opportunity, not trauma, because that was the accepted narrative. The system also evolved in ways that undermined its original logic. By the late 16th century, the Janissaries had become so politically powerful that they resisted attempts to keep the core purely Devshirme recruited. They wanted to pass their positions to their sons. By the 17th century, many Janissaries were Muslim-born Turks whose fathers had been Janissaries, completely subverting the original purpose. As the Janissaries became a hereditary military caste, they also became conservative opponents of reform. They blocked attempts to modernize military training and equipment because new methods threatened their privileged status. They overthrew sultans who tried to create rival military units. They became the very thing the Devshirme system was designed to prevent, an entrenched interest group that put their own privileges above the empire's needs. This is the paradox of institutional success. Systems that work brilliantly can calcify into obstacles if they aren't reformed. The Devshirme system gave the Ottoman Empire administrative and military excellence for over 2 centuries, but by the 18th century, it had become a source of stagnation rather than dynamism. The system was finally abolished by Sultan Muhammad II in the 1820s, but he had to literally massacre the Janissaries to do it. On June 15, 1826, when Janissaries rioted in opposition to military reforms, Muhammad ordered artillery to bombard their barracks. Thousands were killed. The survivors were hunted down and executed. The Janissary Corps was abolished. It was brutal, but from Mahmud's perspective, it was necessary. The institution that had once been the empire's greatest strength had become its greatest liability. This pattern, institutional innovation leading to success, then calcification leading to crisis, appears throughout Ottoman history. Let's talk about another system that shows this dynamic: how the Ottomans managed religious diversity. Part 3. The Millet Istem. Governance through managed pluralism. Istanbul in 1650 contains the following: Greek Orthodox Christians who speak Greek and follow Byzantine church traditions, Armenian Christians who follow their own church hierarchy and use Armenian language, Jews from Spain who speak Ladino, Jews from Central Europe who speak Yiddish, and Arabic-speaking Jews from the Middle East, Muslim Turks, Muslim Arabs, Muslim Albanians, Catholic Christians from former Venetian territories, Protestant merchants from England and Holland. How do you govern this? The European answer in 1650 was, you don't. You enforce religious uniformity, expel or kill heretics, and create religiously homogeneous states. The 30 Years' War, 1648 had just killed roughly 8 million people, primarily over religious differences between Catholics and Protestants. The Ottoman answer was the millet system, and it's one of the most sophisticated approaches to managing diversity that the pre-modern world produced. Here's how it worked in practice. Each recognized religious community, the Rum millet, Greek Orthodox, the Armenian millet, the Jewish millet, and later others, was allowed to govern itself internally according to its own religious law. The Ottoman state didn't care how Greeks handled inheritance disputes or how Jews managed marriage contracts. Those were internal community matters. The head of each millet was responsible to the Ottoman state for their community's behavior and tax payment, but had autonomous authority over community members for non-criminal matters. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul was essentially the ruler of all Orthodox Christians in the empire. He appointed bishops, adjudicated doctrinal disputes, ran church finances, and represented the Orthodox community in dealings with the Ottoman government. He had his own bureaucracy, his own courts, and his own system for collecting community taxes that funded church operations. The same applied to the Armenian Patriarch and the chief rabbi. This created a strange situation where you could live your entire life as an Ottoman subject without ever directly interacting with Muslim authorities. You'd go to your community's courts for legal disputes. You'd pay your taxes through your community's collection system. You'd follow your community's religious laws for family matters. Ottoman Muslims were almost foreign to you, except as neighbors and business partners. From the Ottoman state's perspective, this was rational administration. First, it reduced administrative burden. The state didn't need to create separate legal systems for different religions or train officials in multiple religious law traditions. Each community managed itself using its own expertise. Second, it co-opted religious leaders as government officials. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch wasn't just a religious figure. He was essentially an Ottoman bureaucrat responsible for millions of Christian subjects. His authority came from the Sultan's recognition. This made him dependent on Ottoman power and gave him incentives to keep his community peaceful and tax-paying. Third, it channeled dissent into religious rather than political forms. If you were Greek and unhappy with your situation, you might complain to your patriarch or local bishop, not organize against the Ottoman state. Your identity was primarily religious and communal, not national or political. Fourth, it preserved tax bases and economic productivity. Religious minorities included many merchants, artisans, and skilled professionals. The millet system kept these people productive and paying taxes rather than fleeing or rebelling. But we need to be clear about what this system was and wasn't. It wasn't tolerance in the modern sense. Non-Muslims paid higher taxes, the jizya. They faced legal disadvantages in certain contexts. They couldn't proselytize to Muslims. They were subject to periodic discriminatory regulations about dress or behavior. It wasn't equality. Islamic law held that Muslims were superior to non-Muslims, and this was reflected in legal and social structures. An Ottoman Muslim had advantages in courts, taxes, and social status that non-Muslims lacked. It was pragmatic imperialism. The Ottoman state allowed diversity because it was profitable and administratively convenient, not because of ideological commitment to religious freedom, but compared to what was happening in Europe. The Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion of Jews from multiple kingdoms, the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, the witch hunts, the Ottoman system was remarkably functional, and it had an additional benefit that the Ottomans probably didn't fully anticipate. It made the empire attractive to refugees. When Spain expelled Jews in 1492, tens of thousands settled in Ottoman territories. They brought skills in finance, medicine, printing, and international trade that strengthened the empire economically. Spanish and Portuguese Jews established communities in Thessaloniki, Istanbul, Izmir, and other Ottoman cities that became centers of commerce and culture. When various Christian groups faced persecution in Europe, some found refuge in Ottoman lands. Protestant merchants established trading posts in Ottoman ports. Catholic communities from Venetian territories became Ottoman subjects and continued practicing their faith. The empire became a haven, not because it was ideologically tolerant, but because it was pragmatically indifferent to religious differences as long as you paid taxes and maintained order. This had profound long-term effects on Ottoman society. Cities like Istanbul, Thessaloniki, Izmir, and Jerusalem became incredibly cosmopolitan. Multiple languages were spoken in the streets. Different religious communities lived in close proximity, developed business relationships, and influenced each other culturally. While maintaining distinct identities, Ottoman cuisine absorbed influences from Greek, Armenian, Arab, and Balkan traditions. Ottoman music incorporated Greek and Persian elements. Ottoman architecture showed Byzantine influences. The empire's culture was syncretic in ways that reflected its diversity, but the millet system also had problems that became catastrophic when nationalism emerged as a political force in the 19th century. The system worked as long as people primarily identified by religion, rather than ethnicity or nationality. A Greek Orthodox Christian thought of himself as Orthodox first, not as ethnically Greek, and therefore deserving of a Greek nation-state. An Armenian identified with the Armenian Church, not with Armenian nationalism. But when European ideas of nationalism became a structure that could be exploited for separatism, Greek nationalists used Orthodox Church networks to spread independence ideology. Armenian nationalists organized through Armenian community institutions. The same structures that had kept communities peaceful and self-governing for centuries became vehicles for movements that wanted to break away from the empire. The Ottoman state's response to this nationalist threat was confused and often brutal. Should they maintain the millet system and risk it being used for separatism? Should they try to create a unified Ottoman identity that transcended religious communities? Should they enforce Turkish Muslim dominance and abandon pluralism? Different sultans and reformers tried different approaches. None worked well. The empire oscillated between trying to accommodate diversity and trying to suppress it, creating inconsistent policies that pleased nobody. By the early 20th century, when the Young Turks took power, they had largely abandoned the pluralistic approach in favor of Turkish nationalism. The millet system was officially abolished, replaced by policies that tried to create ethnic and religious homogeneity. The result was the Armenian genocide and the eventual collapse of the empire into multiple nation-states. The millet system, which had enabled peaceful coexistence for centuries, couldn't survive the age of nationalism. This is one of the Ottoman Empire's great tragedies. The same institutions that made it successful for so long became obstacles when the world changed, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to how the empire actually functioned economically and talk about the systems that generated the wealth that paid for everything else. Part 4. The economic engine. How the Ottomans made money. An empire of 30 million people doesn't run on ideology or military conquest alone. It runs on tax revenue, and generating tax revenue from a pre-industrial economy spread across 3 continents is incredibly complex. The Ottomans were surprisingly sophisticated about this. The foundation of the economy was agriculture. It had to be in a world where 90% of the population were farmers. The empire controlled some of the most fertile agricultural regions in the world. The river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Nile Delta in Egypt, the plains of Anatolia and Thrace, the Balkan river valleys. The Ottoman tax system for agriculture was detailed and carefully designed. The land survey, Tahrir, was conducted periodically to record every village, every household, every piece of farmland, and assess its productive capacity. These surveys are goldmines for historians because they recorded population, economic activity, and even details like how many beehives a village had. Tax rates were proportional to land productivity. Better soil and better irrigation meant higher taxes, but also better ability to pay. This aligned incentives. Farmers had reasons to improve their land because they'd keep much of the increased production, but the state benefited too. Multiple types of agricultural taxes existed. Tithe on grain production, taxes on orchards and vineyards, taxes on livestock, and various special levies. But the total tax burden was generally between 2.5–4.0% of production, which was reasonable by medieval standards. The timar system we discussed earlier was the collection mechanism for much of this agricultural wealth. Sipahis collected taxes from their assigned areas, kept a portion for themselves, and passed the rest up the administrative chain. But agriculture was just the foundation. The real economic dynamism came from trade. The Ottoman Empire controlled the crossroads between Europe and Asia. Spice trade from India, silk from Persia and China, coffee from Yemen. All these valuable goods traveled through Ottoman territories. The empire could tax trade at multiple points: customs duties at ports, transit taxes on caravans, market fees in cities. The Ottomans were smart enough to not overtax trade. Yes, they wanted revenue, but they also understood that excessive taxes would just push trade routes elsewhere. The customs duty on goods passing through Ottoman territories was typically 4–5%, high enough to generate significant revenue from massive trade volumes, low enough to keep trade flowing through Ottoman-controlled routes rather than around them. Ottoman cities developed sophisticated market systems regulated by guilds. Every craft and trade had its guild: Lonka, the Baker's Guild, the Jewelers Guild, the Leather Workers Guild, the Carpet Weavers Guild. These guilds set quality standards, regulated prices, controlled entry into trades, and provided social support for members. This sounds restrictive, and it was, but it also created stability and trust. When you bought goods in an Ottoman market, you knew they met certain standards because the guilds enforced quality control. This made Ottoman cities attractive for commerce. The empire also developed relatively sophisticated financial instruments and institutions: Vakuf, Waqf system, religious endowments that funded mosques, schools, hospitals, and public works. Wealthy individuals would donate property or revenue sources to establish a waqf, which would generate income in perpetuity for specified purposes. This created a semi-autonomous sector of the economy dedicated to public goods, credit and money lending, while Islamic law technically prohibited interest, riba. Ottoman practice found workarounds through profit-sharing partnerships and various financial arrangements that accomplished the same goals. Jewish and Christian communities, not bound by Islamic prohibitions on interest, played important roles in finance and money lending, coinage, and monetary policy. The Ottoman state maintained multiple currencies: the akir, the sultan, the para, and later the kurush, and tried to manage their value through periodic debasement and reforms. This wasn't always successful. Inflation was a recurring problem. But the empire understood that monetary stability was economically important. State monopolies, certain valuable goods like salt, tobacco, and coffee, were state monopolies. The government controlled production or import and sold at markup, generating revenue while controlling strategically important commodities. But perhaps the most important economic institution was one that often gets overlooked: infrastructure maintenance. The Ottoman state invested heavily in roads and bridges. Caravanserai, roadside inns, were built along major trade routes, providing secure stopping points for merchants. Bridges were constructed and maintained. Roads were patrolled to reduce banditry. This made trade safer and faster. Ports and shipyards. The Ottoman Empire was a Mediterranean power, and it maintained extensive naval infrastructure. Istanbul, Alexandria, Algiers, and other ports had shipyards that could build and repair both naval and commercial vessels. Water management: aqueducts supplied cities with water. Irrigation systems supported agriculture. Public fountains provided clean water. This infrastructure was expensive but essential for urban life and agricultural productivity. Markets and commercial spaces, covered markets, bedestans, and bazaars were built and maintained. Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, which still exists today, was constructed in the 15th century and expanded over subsequent centuries into one of the largest covered markets in the world. All of this cost money, but it also generated economic activity that could be taxed, creating a virtuous cycle when managed properly. The empire's economy was successful enough to support a population that grew from roughly 1.215 million in the early 16th century to 2.530 million by the mid-16th century. This population growth indicates that the economy was producing enough surplus to feed more people while maintaining or improving living standards. But there were structural problems that became severe over time. First, the discovery of Atlantic trade routes diminished the importance of overland routes through Ottoman territory. When Portuguese and later Dutch and English ships could sail directly to Asia around Africa, Mediterranean trade became less central to global commerce. Ottoman transit taxes generated less revenue. Second, inflation from Spanish-American silver flooded the global economy in the 16th-17th centuries. The Ottoman monetary system struggled to maintain stability as silver prices collapsed. This hurt anyone on fixed incomes, including many officials, and created economic chaos. Third, the empire's tax system became less efficient as corruption grew. Local officials embezzled more. Tax farming, where the right to collect taxes was auctioned to private individuals, became more common, and tax farmers often squeezed peasants harder than the official rates to maximize their profits. Fourth, the empire failed to keep pace with European economic innovations. Banking systems, joint stock companies, insurance, and later industrial production developed more quickly in Europe. The Ottoman economy remained primarily agricultural and commercial, while European economies were transforming. Fifth, capitulations granted to European powers gave foreign merchants economic advantages over Ottoman subjects. Treaties with France, England, and other powers allowed their merchants to pay lower taxes and enjoy legal privileges in Ottoman territories. This was meant to encourage trade, but it created situations where foreigners had better terms than locals. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was economically stagnating relative to Europe. It was still wealthy in absolute terms. Ottoman cities were larger and often more prosperous than many European cities, but the gap was closing and then reversing. This economic decline undermined everything else. Military reforms required money. Bureaucratic efficiency required paying officials adequately. Infrastructure maintenance required investment. When economic growth slowed and tax revenues became less reliable, the entire system began to struggle. But even during decline, the economic systems continued functioning. Markets still operated. Trade still flowed. Agriculture still produced. The institutional capacity built up over centuries kept things running even as the empire weakened. Let's shift now to talk about something that reveals both Ottoman sophistication and Ottoman brutality: the justice system. Part 5. Justice and Law. The Cadis and court justice in the Ottoman Empire was administered through a network of judges called Cadis. And the system they operated was surprisingly accessible and well documented. A Qadi was an Islamic legal scholar who served as judge, notary, and local administrator in a town or city. He was appointed by the central government, paid a salary, and could be transferred or dismissed. He wasn't a local notable who inherited the position. He was a professional legal expert who had studied Islamic law and Ottoman regulations. Qadis held court daily, and anyone could bring a case. You didn't need a lawyer. You didn't need to file extensive paperwork. You showed up at the Qadi's court, stated your case, presented your witnesses or evidence, and the Qadi rendered a judgment based on Islamic law and Ottoman legal codes. And here's something remarkable. The Qadi's court kept detailed records. The Qadi Sicileri court records are one of the most valuable sources for understanding daily life in the Ottoman Empire. Millions of pages of these records survive in archives across former Ottoman territories. They record everything: property transactions, marriage contracts, divorce proceedings, inheritance disputes, criminal cases, commercial disputes, appointment of guardians for orphans, registration of Wakel cases. Let me give you a few examples of actual cases to show what this looked like. Istanbul, 1658. A woman named Fatima brings a complaint against her husband Ahmed, claiming he has failed to provide adequate support. She presents witnesses who confirm her claim. The Qadi orders Ahmed to either provide proper maintenance, according to Islamic law, or grant her a divorce. Ahmed agrees to provide adequate support, and the agreement is recorded. What this shows: women could take their husbands to court and win judgments. Islamic law required husbands to support their wives, and this was enforceable through the legal system. While the overall system favored men, it wasn't completely without protections for women. Aleppo, 1596. A Christian merchant accuses a Muslim trader of failing to deliver goods that were paid for. Both parties present their version of events. The Muslim trader claims the goods were delivered. The Christian merchant brings written documentation showing the payment, but no receipt for delivery. The Qadi rules in favor of the Christian merchant and orders the Muslim trader to deliver the goods or refund the money. What this shows: non-Muslims could sue Muslims and win if they had better evidence. The court system wasn't entirely biased by religion. Evidence and documentation mattered. Cairo, 1525. A woman registers the sale of property she inherited from her father. The Qadi verifies her identity, confirms she has the right to sell the property under Islamic inheritance law, and records the transaction. The buyer pays, the property transfer is documented, and both parties receive copies of the legal record. What this shows, women could own property, inherit property, and conduct business independently. The Islamic inheritance system gave women smaller shares than men, typically half what brothers received, but they did have property rights that were legally protected. Bursa, 1487. A Jewish merchant brings a dispute with another Jewish merchant over a business partnership that went bad. The Qadi refers the case to the Jewish community's court system to handle under Jewish law, but records that the case was filed in case there are questions later. What this shows, the millet system in practice, non-Muslims could use their own community courts for internal disputes, but the Ottoman judicial system provided a backup option if community mediation failed. These weren't exceptional cases. This was daily routine across hundreds of Ottoman cities and towns. The Qadis processed thousands of cases annually, and the system generally worked. But let's talk about what the system wasn't. It wasn't equal. In cases between Muslims and non-Muslims, the testimony of a Muslim man counted more than the testimony of a non-Muslim or a woman. Two women's testimony equaled one man's testimony in many types of cases. These rules were based on Islamic legal interpretation of the time and were discriminatory by modern standards. It wasn't consistent across all circumstances. Local customs, political pressure, and the individual Qadi's interpretation could affect outcomes. A powerful local figure might get favorable treatment, even if the law technically didn't support their position. It wasn't without corruption. Bribes were possible. Wealthy litigants had advantages. Some Qadis were more honest than others. It had limited jurisdiction over criminal law in some areas. Serious criminal matters, especially those involving political concerns or military personnel, might be handled by other authorities. The Janissaries, for example, had their own internal justice system for many offenses. Despite these limitations, the system provided access to legal process that was unusual for the medieval and early modern world. A peasant could bring a grievance against a local official and get a hearing. Contracts were enforceable. Property rights were protected, at least in theory. The system also evolved over time in response to changing needs. Qanun, Sultanic law, supplemented Islamic Sharia law. While Sharia provided the foundation, Sultanic decrees addressed areas where Islamic law was silent or where practical governance required different rules. Criminal law, administrative regulations, and taxation were largely governed by Qanun rather than pure Sharia. Specialized courts emerged for different types of cases. Commercial courts handled trade disputes. Military courts dealt with soldier offenses. Later, mixed courts were established to handle cases involving both Ottoman subjects and foreign nationals. Legal codes were compiled and standardized. The Qanun of Mehmed II and later legal compilations tried to create more uniform law across the empire, reducing regional variation, but the legal system faced the same problems as other Ottoman institutions. As the empire weakened, law enforcement became less effective, corruption increased. Powerful local figures could ignore judgments they didn't like. The central government's ability to enforce legal decisions in distant provinces diminished. By the 19th century, the Tanzimat reforms attempted to modernize the legal system by introducing more European-style codes and procedures. New courts were established. Legal education was reformed. The entire system was being rebuilt to match European standards. But this created its own problems. Now you had multiple overlapping legal systems: Sharia courts, secular courts, commercial courts, mixed courts, religious community courts, and it wasn't always clear which had jurisdiction. The legal modernization was incomplete and inconsistent. The legal system's trajectory mirrors the empire's overall story. Sophisticated institutions that worked well at their peak, gradual degradation through corruption and inefficiency, attempted reforms that were too little and too late. Now let's talk about the military system beyond just the famous Janissaries, because Ottoman military organization was far more complex and interesting than most people realize. Part 6. The military machine. Beyond the Janissaries, everyone knows about the Janissaries, the elite slave soldier infantry corps recruited through the Deveshimi system. They're the iconic Ottoman military unit, and they deserve their fame. But focusing only on the Janissaries misses the complexity and sophistication of Ottoman military organization. The Ottoman military was actually multiple interconnected forces, the Kapik Kulu, standing army. This included the Janissaries, infantry, the Sipahi of the port, cavalry guard units, the Sibasi, armorer corps, the top Arab artillery guard units. These were full-time professional soldiers paid regular salaries by the central government. They numbered around 40,000, 5,000 at the system's peak, the Timar cavalry. We've discussed this already. The Sipahis, who held Timars and reported for campaigns with additional troops. These numbered 90,000 plus at peak and formed the bulk of Ottoman cavalry. Provincial forces. Each eyalet, province, had its own military forces, separate from the Timur system. Vassal forces. The Ottoman Empire included numerous vassal states, especially in the Balkans and North Africa, that were obligated to provide troops when requested. Wallachia, Moldavia, Transylvania, before full conquest. The Barbary states all contributed forces to Ottoman campaigns. Auxiliary forces, tribal groups, especially from Anatolia and the Arab territories, provided irregular cavalry. These were raiders and light cavalry used for reconnaissance and raiding rather than pitched battles. Navy. The Ottoman Navy was a separate military structure with its own administrative system, shipyards, and recruitment. At its peak in the 16th century, it was the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean. This military structure was incredibly sophisticated for its time. The Ottomans could mobilize forces numbering 100,000 plus for major campaigns, maintain multiple theaters of operation simultaneously, and project power across 3 continents. The logistics of Ottoman military campaigns were impressive. Supply chains. Ottoman armies on campaign were followed by massive supply trains, food, ammunition, fodder for horses, weapons, tents, and equipment. The tens of thousands of soldiers had to be transported and distributed. The Ottoman military had developed detailed systems for planning and managing these logistics. Siege capability. The Ottomans were masters of siege warfare. Their artillery corps could deploy massive cannons capable of breaching medieval fortifications. They developed sophisticated siege engineering techniques. When an Ottoman army besieged a city, it brought the full weight of advanced military technology, communication systems. The empire maintained a courier system, ULAC, that could transmit messages across vast distances relatively quickly. During campaigns, messengers kept Istanbul informed of progress and carried orders from the Sultan or Grand Vizier to commanders in the field. Medical support. Ottoman armies included physicians and medical staff. Soldiers weren't just abandoned when wounded. There were organized efforts to treat injuries and diseases, but the Ottoman military had vulnerabilities that became more apparent over time. First, the system was built for offensive campaigns, not prolonged defensive warfare. The Timur system worked beautifully for annual campaigns into enemy territory. Sipahis would report for duty, campaign for the summer season, and return home. But when the empire stopped expanding and had to defend long borders against multiple enemies, the seasonal campaign model didn't work as well. Second, the empire was slow to adopt new military technologies and tactics. The Ottomans were early adopters of gunpowder technology. Ottoman artillery was superior to European artillery in the 15th, 16th centuries, but by the 17th, 18th centuries, European military innovation had overtaken them. New infantry tactics, better integration of different military arms, more sophisticated officer training. The Ottomans fell behind. Third, the Janissaries became a conservative political force. We've mentioned this before, but it's worth emphasizing. The Janissaries resisted military modernization because it threatened their privileged position. They overthrew sultans who tried to create rival military units. This institutional conservatism was militarily disastrous. Fourth, the navy declined after Lepanto 1571 and never fully recovered its dominance. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet quickly, but the Mediterranean was no longer an Ottoman lake after the late 16th century. European navies, especially the Dutch and English, surpassed Ottoman naval technology. Fifth, military finances became increasingly problematic. Inflation, economic stagnation, and corruption meant that soldiers weren't paid regularly. Unpaid soldiers were unreliable at best and rebellious at worst. Provincial forces became more like private armies loyal to local governors rather than the Sultan. The pattern is familiar. Systems that worked brilliantly during the empire's expansion phase became liabilities during stagnation and decline. The most dramatic illustration of this was the attempted military reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries and the resistance they faced. Sultan Selim III, 1789-1807, tried to create a new modern military force called the Nizam-Sedid, New Order. He hired European military advisors, adopted European drill and tactics, and tried to build a military that could compete with European armies. The Janissaries revolted. In 1807, they deposed Selim, then installed a puppet sultan. The Nizam-Sedid was disbanded. Military reform was abandoned. It took Sultan Mahmud II of the Janissaries in 1826, the auspicious incident we mentioned earlier, to finally break the deadlock. Only after the Janissary Corps was abolished could real military modernization proceed. But by then, the empire was a generation or more behind European military development. Russian armies defeated Ottoman forces in a series of wars. European powers intervened repeatedly in Ottoman territories. The empire that had once threatened Vienna was now barely able to defend its own territories. The military decline mirrors institutional decline throughout the empire. Sophisticated systems that calcified conservative resistance to necessary change, and eventual catastrophic reform that came too late to reverse the empire's decline. Let's shift now to something often overlooked in Ottoman history: the role of women and the reality of the imperial harem. Part 7: Women and Power. The harem, a political institution. The word harem in Western imagination conjures images of scantily clad women lounging around waiting to please the Sultan, guarded by eunuchs, living in oppressed captivity. This Orientalist fantasy obscures the reality. The Ottoman imperial harem was a political institution where women wielded real power and influence. Yes, the harem was based on practices we'd consider deeply problematic: concubinage, slavery, gender segregation, and patriarchal control. But within that framework, women navigated complex political environments and sometimes became the actual power behind the throne. Let's start with how the harem functioned as an institution. The imperial harem housed the Sultan's mother, Valide Sultan, his concubines, his daughters, his sisters, and female servants and slaves. It was a large complex within the palace, with its own hierarchy, rules, and power structures. Young women entered the harem through several routes: capture or purchased as slaves. Many harem women were originally Christian girls, captured in wars or raids, or purchased from slave markets. They'd be brought to the palace, converted to Islam, trained in etiquette and arts, and potentially catch the Sultan's attention. Gifts from officials. Provincial governors and high-ranking officials sometimes sent beautiful women as gifts to the Sultan, hoping to curry favor. Selection through networks. Agents would sometimes search for beautiful and talented girls to bring to the palace. This was slavery, and it was brutal in many ways. These women had no choice. They were property. But once in the harem, there was a hierarchy of opportunity. Most women remained servants. They'd never approach the Sultan and would spend their lives as attendants to higher-ranking concubines or the Valide Sultan. Some became concubines, Kari, who served the Sultan sexually. This gave them status above ordinary servants but didn't guarantee influence. A few became favorites, Iqbal, who had the Sultan's regular attention. This was a position of real privilege. Very few became mothers of the Sultan's children. Giving birth to a prince or princess changed everything. A mother of a prince became a potential future Valide Sultan if her son became Sultan. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was often the most powerful woman in the empire, and sometimes the most powerful person after the Sultan himself. Consider Kosum Sultan, 1589-1651. She was likely of Greek origin, brought to the harem as a slave, and became a concubine of Sultan Ahmed I. She bore him multiple sons. When Ahmed died, her son Murad IV eventually became Sultan, making her valid as sultan. When Murad died, her other son Ibrahim became sultan, and she remained valid as sultan. When Ibrahim was deposed, her grandson Mehmed IV became sultan, and she remained the power behind the throne as the new young sultan's grandmother. Kösem Sultan effectively controlled the Ottoman Empire for decades. She influenced appointments, directed policy, managed state finances, and operated as a shadow ruler during periods when weak sultans or child sultans were on the throne. She was eventually assassinated by rival palace factions, not because she was powerless, but because she had too much power. This was during the Sultanate of Women, Kabdinla Sultanati, roughly 1533-1656, when women of the imperial harem wielded extraordinary political influence. Roxolana, Hürrem Sultan, influenced Suleiman the Magnificent's policies, corresponded with foreign rulers, and orchestrated the execution of potential rivals to ensure her son's succession. Nurbanu Sultan effectively controlled the empire during her son Murad III's reign, 1574-1595, managing foreign policy and state appointments. Safiye Sultan wielded power during her son Mehmed III's reign and continued influencing policy during her grandson's reign. These women weren't exceptions. They represented a period when institutional circumstances gave harem women access to political power. Here's why. The practice of fratricide meant that princes who didn't become sultan were killed, so there were fewer adult male royal family members who could check the sultan's power. The practice of confining princes in the kafes cage meant that sultans who did take the throne often had no political or military experience and were easily influenced. The practice of not giving the title of sultan to living former sultans meant that when a sultan was deposed or died, there was no experienced former ruler who could advise or balance power. Women were the only royal family members around the sultan who weren't potential threats to his throne. His brothers were threats or were dead. His sons were potential rivals, but his mother, sisters, and wives weren't going to seize the throne for themselves. This created opportunities for capable women to step into power vacuums, but we shouldn't romanticize this. These women operated under severe constraints. They couldn't appear in public. Their power was always exercised from behind closed doors. They were dependent on the sultan or their sons. A concubine who fell out of favor or whose son died lost everything. They faced ruthless competition from other women. Harem politics could be deadly. Poisonings, accusations, and conspiracies were constant. They had no legal status as individuals. Under Islamic law and Ottoman practice, concubines were slaves, and even the valid sultan's power was informal rather than legally defined. Their political activity was often criticized. Religious conservatives and traditionalists saw female political influence as improper and blamed women for the empire's problems. The Sultanate of Women ended not because women stopped being ambitious or capable, but because political circumstances changed. When stronger sultans took power and asserted control, women's informal influence was reduced. Beyond the imperial harem, what was life like for ordinary Ottoman women? It varied enormously by class, location, and religion. Elite urban women lived in relative seclusion in family households. They had servants, didn't work outside the home, and spent time on family management, religious observance, and social networks with other elite women. Working-class urban women worked in various occupations, as domestic servants, in textile production, as midwives, as vendors, in women's markets. They had less rigid seclusion because they needed to work. Rural peasant women worked in agriculture alongside men, managed households, and had less formal gender segregation because rural life was less regulated. Non-Muslim women had more flexibility in some ways. Christian and Jewish women could be more publicly active in their communities and weren't subject to Islamic modesty requirements. Ottoman women could own property, inherit property, run businesses, and go to court to enforce their rights. The court records show countless cases of women buying and selling property, operating businesses, and defending their legal interests. But they did this within a system that legally privileged men. Inheritance laws gave women half of what men received. Divorce was easier for men than women. Polygamy was legal, though actually rare except among the very wealthy. Women's testimony counted less in court. The Ottoman system on women's rights was ahead of some contemporary societies and behind others. Byzantine women before the Ottoman conquest had certain legal protections that were maintained for Christian women under the millet system. European women's legal status varied but was often similarly restrictive. What's clear is that Ottoman women, elite and ordinary, Muslim and non-Muslim, weren't simply passive victims. They navigated complex systems, found ways to exercise agency within constraints, and sometimes achieved remarkable power and influence. The harem story illustrates the empire's broader characteristics: institutions that could be both oppressive and empowering, systems that created opportunities within severe constraints, and power structures that were more complex than surface appearances suggested. Now let's talk about something that gets far less attention than it deserves: Ottoman public health, urban planning, and social services. Part 8. The welfare state. Part 8. A man, public service. Medieval and early modern states weren't known for caring about public welfare. You were born, you worked, you hoped you didn't get sick or go hungry, and you died. The state's job was to collect taxes and maintain order, not to provide services to common people. The Ottoman Empire was different, not because it was altruistic, but because Islamic tradition and pragmatic governance created systems for public welfare that were unusual for their time. The foundation was the Wakfa system, religious endowments that funded public services. Wealthy individuals would donate property, revenue sources, or cash to establish a vakuf for specific purposes: building and maintaining a mosque, funding a school, supporting a hospital, providing food for the poor, maintaining public fountains, repairing bridges. Once established, a vakuf continued in perpetuity. The donated property or revenue couldn't be seized or sold. It generated income forever for its designated purpose. By the 17th century, approximately 1/3 of all property in the Ottoman Empire was vakuf property. This was an enormous sector of the economy dedicated to public services. Let's talk about what this produced. Hospitals, Darushifa. Major Ottoman cities had hospitals that provided free medical care. The Süleymaniye Hospital in Istanbul, built in the 16th century, had separate wards for different diseases, a medical school, a pharmacy, and staff that included physicians, surgeons, and pharmacists. These weren't just Islamic institutions. They inherited Byzantine and Persian medical knowledge, translated Greek and Roman medical texts, and contributed to medical advancement. Ottoman, Jewish, and Christian physicians were prominent in medicine. Treatment was free for the poor. The vakuf funding the hospital paid all expenses. Public kitchens, imaret. Large mosque complexes included imrets that provided free meals daily. The Süleymaniye Imaret in Istanbul fed thousands of people daily. Students, travelers, the poor, anyone who needed food. This was a form of social welfare. If you were destitute, you could get a free meal at the Imaret. This prevented some level of starvation and reduced social unrest. Schools and libraries. Vakufs funded mektebs, elementary schools, and madrasas, higher education institutions. Education was free for students. Libraries attached to mosques and schools provided access to books and manuscripts. Public baths, hammam. Ottoman cities had numerous public baths, hammam. Ottoman cities had numerous public baths funded by vakuf in an era before private plumbing. Hammams provided places where people could maintain hygiene, which had real public health benefits. Public fountains. Clean water distribution was crucial for urban life. Elaborate fountain systems brought water from distant sources into cities and distributed it through public fountains where anyone could get free water. Roads and bridges. Many vakufs funded maintenance of infrastructure, repairing roads, maintaining bridges, building caravanserais for travelers, care for the disabled and elderly. Some vakufs specifically supported people who couldn't work due to disability or old age, providing them with monthly stipends or accommodation. The Ottomans didn't invent charitable endowments. Islamic tradition and earlier Islamic states had similar systems, but the Ottomans systematized and expanded the vakuf system to a degree that made it central to social organization. The system had additional benefits beyond just providing services. It reduced the state's fiscal burden. The government didn't have to pay for all these services because vakuf funded them. This made the system attractive to rulers. It gave wealthy individuals a way to gain religious merit and social prestige. Establishing a large vakif that built a mosque complex with hospital, school, and public kitchen made you a public benefactor and ensured your name would be remembered. It created employment. All these vakuf institutions needed staff teachers, physicians, cooks, maintenance workers, administrators. This provided livelihoods for thousands of people. It stabilized social order. When people could get food, medical care, and education through charitable institutions, they were less likely to riot or turn to banditry out of desperation. But the system had problems. Vakifs were inflexible. Once established, a vakif's purpose couldn't easily be changed. If circumstances changed, and the original purpose became irrelevant or less important, the vakif still had to spend its income on that purpose. This created inefficiencies. Vakif property being inalienable meant that productive property was taken out of the regular economy. Some economists argue this reduced economic dynamism because so much property was locked into endowments that couldn't be bought, sold, or repair. Corruption was possible. Vakif administrators Mutaveli were supposed to manage the endowment for public benefit, but some embezzled funds or mismanaged property. Oversight was imperfect. The system favored urban areas over rural areas. Cities had numerous vakufs providing services. Rural villages might have very few. This created inequality in access to education and healthcare. Despite these problems, the vakuf system provided a level of social services that most contemporary European states couldn't match. Compare Ottoman Istanbul in 1550 to London in 1550. Istanbul had multiple hospitals providing free care, numerous public kitchens feeding the poor, elaborate public bath systems, a sophisticated water distribution network, and dozens of educational institutions. London had a few charitable institutions, mostly church-run, that provided some poor relief. Healthcare was largely private and expensive. Public health infrastructure was minimal. Education was primarily for the wealthy. The difference isn't that Ottomans were more humanitarian. It's that Islamic religious tradition emphasized charity, and the Ottoman state had institutionalized that tradition into a system that provided real services. This matters when we think about the empire's longevity and stability. People will tolerate a lot from a government that provides basic services, food in times of scarcity, healthcare when sick, education for children, water infrastructure, and security. The Ottoman state wasn't a modern welfare state, but it had elements of social protection that made it more stable than states that left their populations completely to their own devices. As the empire declined, even this system began to fail. Vakif revenues decreased as economic stagnation reduced property income. Corruption increased as central oversight weakened. New institutions weren't established as quickly as population grew. By the 19th century, the social services that had once been a strength were inadequate. But for centuries, the system worked, and it's one more example of Ottoman institutional sophistication. Now we need to talk about the empire's final century and why institutional inertia couldn't save it from the forces that were tearing it apart. Part 9. The Reform Era and the failure of modernization. By the 19th century, Ottoman officials understood their empire was in trouble. The question was, what to do about it? And the answer was the Tanzimat, a period of sweeping reforms from 1839 to 1876, meant to modernize the empire along European lines. We've mentioned the Tanzimat before, but now let's dig into what it actually tried to accomplish and why it ultimately failed. The reforms touched nearly every institution. Legal reform, new legal codes based on French law were introduced, a commercial code, 1850, a land code, 1858, and civil procedures were all reformed or created from scratch. The goal was to create modern, uniform legal systems that could handle commercial and civil matters efficiently. Administrative reform. The empire was reorganized into vilayets, provinces, with governors who had defined powers and responsibilities. Councils Miklais were established at provincial and district levels to involve local notables in administration. Detailed regulations defined bureaucratic procedures. Military reform. The army was completely reorganized along European lines. Conscription was introduced. Military schools trained officers in modern warfare. European advisors helped restructure command systems. New weapons and tactics were adopted. Educational reform. New schools were established to teach European languages, sciences, engineering, and modern subjects. The traditional religious education system continued, but now competed with secular schools that trained bureaucrats, military officers, engineers, and professionals needed for a modern state. Financial reform. The empire tried to rationalize its tax system, create budgets, and establish modern banking. The Ottoman Bank was founded in 1856 as a central bank. Attempts were made to manage the empire's growing foreign debt. Infrastructure investment. Railways were built connecting major cities. Telegraph lines were installed. Steamship companies were established. Ports were modernized. This required massive investment, much of it financed by European loans. Social reform. The most controversial, the Tanzimat promised legal equality for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion. The Hatteh Sherif of Gulhan, 1839, and the Hatteh Humayun, 1856, declared that all subjects would be equal before the law, have equal opportunity for government positions, and receive equal treatment in taxation and military service. This was revolutionary. The traditional Islamic legal system placed non-Muslims in a subordinate position. The millet system institutionalized religious difference. Now the empire was saying that religion shouldn't determine legal status. This triggered fierce opposition. Conservative Muslims saw this as abandoning Islamic principles. If Muslims and non-Muslims were equal, what was the point of having an Islamic empire? Religious scholars and traditionalists resisted reforms as Western corruption. Non-Muslims were skeptical. Legal equality on paper didn't change social discrimination or centuries of established practice. Many Greek, Armenian, and Slavic communities were already thinking in nationalist terms and wanted independence, not equality within the empire. Turkish and Muslim subjects felt threatened by the possibility that non-Muslims would compete for government positions and status that had traditionally been Muslim privileges. The reforms satisfied almost nobody. They weren't thorough enough for modernizers who wanted more radical westernization. They were too radical for conservatives who wanted to preserve tradition. They didn't address the nationalist aspirations of groups who wanted independence. And there was a deeper problem. The reforms were expensive and required borrowing from European banks. The Ottoman Empire went deep into debt to finance modernization. Railways built with European loans, military equipment purchased from European manufacturers, foreign advisors paid salaries, new schools and institutions funded. Expensive wars, Crimean War, Russo-Turkish wars that required additional borrowing. By 1875, the empire couldn't service its debts. Ottoman government bonds defaulted. European creditors established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, which took control of significant portions of Ottoman revenue to ensure debt repayment. Think about this. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been the wealthiest power in the Mediterranean, was now essentially financially controlled by foreign creditors. European representatives sat in Istanbul collecting Ottoman taxes to repay European banks. The empire had tried to modernize using European loans and now was financially subservient to European powers. Meanwhile, nationalist movements were tearing the empire apart. Greek independence, 1820s, established a Greek nation-state from former Ottoman territories. Serbian removed the Balkans from Ottoman control throughout the 19th century. Armenian nationalism grew in response to continued discrimination and the hope for an independent Armenian state. Arab nationalism began developing in the late 19th century, questioning why Arabs should be ruled by Turks. The Tanzimat's promise of equality within the empire couldn't compete with the appeal of independent nation-states. Why be an equal citizen of a multi-ethnic empire when you could have your own country, where your ethnic group was dominant? The Ottoman response to nationalism was confused and often brutal. Sometimes they tried accommodation, granting autonomy, recognizing national identities within an Ottoman framework. Sometimes they tried suppression, military force against rebels, denial of nationalist aspirations. Sometimes they tried reform, offering constitutional government, parliament, more local control. Nothing worked consistently. Each approach had supporters and opponents within the Ottoman government. Policy zigzagged between approaches without coherent strategy. The young Ottoman movement in the 1860s to 70s pushed for constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government. Sultan Abdülhamid Disek granted a constitution in 1876, establishing a parliament. Then he suspended it in 1878 after less than 2 years and ruled as an autocrat for the next 30 years. When the Young Turks forced restoration of the constitution in 1908, it seemed like a renewal. Instead, it accelerated the empire's collapse. The Young Turks, influenced by European nationalism, tried to create a more unified, Turkish-dominated empire. This alienated non-Turkish groups even further. The Balkan Wars 1912-1913 expelled the Ottomans from almost all their remaining European territories. World War I was the final catastrophe. The empire entered the war, allied with Germany, fought on multiple fronts, suffered massive casualties, and was defeated. British forces captured Jerusalem and Baghdad. The Arab Revolt removed Ottoman control from the Hijaz. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. And during the war, the Young Turk government implemented the Armenian genocide, the systematic massacre and deportation of Armenians that killed hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people. When the war ended, the empire was finished. Allied powers were prepared to partition Anatolia itself among European powers and Greek and Armenian states. Only Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's nationalist resistance prevented complete partition. He led Turkish forces in a war of independence, expelled occupying forces, negotiated the Treaty of Lausanne that recognized Turkish sovereignty and abolished the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922. The Ottoman Empire, which had lasted 623 years, was gone. The Turkish Republic that replaced it explicitly rejected the Ottoman legacy, embraced secular nationalism, and tried to become a modern Western-oriented nation-state. The Arab provinces became European colonies or mandates until mid-20th century. The Balkans became a patchwork of ethnically based nation-states that would spend the 20th century fighting over borders and ethnic minorities. The Ottoman system, the elaborate, sophisticated machinery of empire we've been discussing, collapsed not gradually but catastrophically, leaving chaos, violence, and unresolved conflicts in its wake. Confusion, the system that couldn't adapt fast enough. The Ottoman Empire wasn't destroyed by inherent flaws in its institutions. For centuries, those institutions worked brilliantly. The Timar system mobilized cavalry more efficiently than European feudalism. The Devashirme system created loyal, talented administrators. The millet system managed diversity better than contemporary European attempts at religious uniformity. The Vakuf system provided social services that most states didn't attempt. The bureaucratic machinery collected taxes, maintained order, and administered justice across 3 continents. These weren't primitive or inferior systems. They were sophisticated responses to governance challenges that created the longest-lasting Islamic empire in history. The empire was destroyed because the world changed faster than the institutions could adapt. Nationalism emerged as a political force that made multi-ethnic empires obsolete. Once people started thinking of themselves primarily as Greeks or Armenians or Arabs, rather than as Orthodox or Christian or Muslim subjects of the Sultan, the millet system became a liability instead of a strength. European economic and military power grew faster than Ottoman power. The Industrial Revolution, financial innovations, and new military technologies gave European states enormous advantages that the Ottomans couldn't match quickly enough. The empire's own institutions calcified and resisted necessary reforms. The Janissaries blocked military modernization. Religious conservatives opposed legal reforms. Entrenched interests benefited from the old system and fought to preserve it. Every reform attempt triggered resistance from some faction. Modernizers fought conservatives, Muslims resented non-Muslim equality. Non-Muslims wanted independence. The empire couldn't build consensus for change. The empire's geographic extent became a vulnerability. Ruling from Istanbul to Yemen, from Algeria to Baghdad, was an incredible administrative achievement when the world moved slowly. But when railways, telegraphs, and modern communications gave smaller European states advantages of speed and coordination, the Ottoman Empire's size meant more borders to defend, more nationalist movements to suppress, more opportunities for foreign interference. The tragedy is, the Ottomans understood the problem. The Tanzimat reformers knew the empire needed to modernize. They implemented reforms that would have been effective if they'd had more time and resources. They weren't ignorant or resistant to change. They were trying desperately to transform a centuries-old system while simultaneously fighting wars, managing debt, and dealing with internal opposition. It wasn't enough. The Ottoman Empire's story is ultimately about institutional life cycles. Systems that solve problems brilliantly can become obstacles when circumstances change. Institutions that provide stability can prevent necessary adaptation. Success can create vested interests that resist reform even when reform is essential for survival. This is why the Ottoman Empire matters as a historical subject beyond just Middle Eastern or Islamic history. It's a case study in how empires actually function, how they build administrative systems, manage diversity, generate revenue, maintain armies, provide services, and exercise power across vast distances. It's also a case study in how empires fail, not through single catastrophic events, but through the accumulation of problems that institutions can't solve fast enough, through resistance to necessary change, through the emergence of forces like nationalism that make old systems obsolete. When we call the Ottoman Empire the most powerful Islamic empire in history, we're recognizing not just its military conquests or territorial extent, but its institutional sophistication. The Ottomans built a machine of empire more complex and durable than any other Islamic power had created. That machine ran for over 6 centuries, longer than any other Islamic empire. It adapted multiple times, absorbing gunpowder technology, incorporating new territories, surviving devastating defeats, implementing reforms. But eventually, the machine couldn't keep pace with the rate of change in the modern world. The gears ground slower. The systems that had worked for centuries became inefficient. The reforms came too slowly or too late, or created more problems than they solved. And when the machine finally broke down in World War I, it didn't just stop. It exploded into fragments that became modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel/Palestine, and various other states and conflicts that still shape our world. The Ottoman Empire's institutional legacy is visible today in surprising places, in the bureaucratic systems of Turkey and other successor states, in the religious structures that survived the empire's collapse, in the legal traditions that influenced modern systems, in the architectural heritage of cities from Budapest to Baghdad, in the cultural influences that shaped Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilization. But perhaps the most important legacy is the lesson about institutions and change, that even the most sophisticated systems eventually face obsolescence if they can't adapt quickly enough, that vested interests will resist necessary reform, that success in one era doesn't guarantee survival in the next, and that empires that fail to evolve will eventually be replaced by systems better suited to their times. The Ottoman Empire was the greatest Islamic power in history because it built institutional systems that worked for over 600 years. It ultimately failed because those same systems couldn't transform fast enough for the modern world. That's not a story of simple success or failure. It's a story of how complex systems rise, adapt, calcify, and eventually collapse, and how that process shapes the world for generations afterward.